I was halfway through changing the oil on my 1967 Massey Ferguson tractor when she came stomping up the driveway in her pressed khakis and oversized sunglasses, like she owned the place. Margaret Rimley, president of our HOA and self, declared empress of the cul-de-sac. "Garrison," she screeched, arms crossed like a prison warden. "This is your final warning. That thing," she motioned at my tractor like it was a diseased cow, "violates the vehicle aesthetic policy. If it's not gone by tomorrow morning, we're having it towed." I wiped my hands on a rag, blinked at her, and said, "You're going to tow a tractor from my own driveway on my own land?" She nodded like she'd rehearsed the line in front of a mirror. "We voted on it. It's an eyesore and it lowers property values. You have 24 hours. That's when I realized this wasn't just a power trip, it was personal. Margaret had been on my case ever since I moved in 3 years ago. First it was my non-standard mailbox, then it was the color of my shed. Now it was my tractor, an old family heirloom I used weekly to help my neighbor clear fallen branches and mow the larger plots. Everyone else in the neighborhood loved it, but not Margaret. "Not happening," I said flatly. She smiled, tight and smug. "Then you'll be hearing from our attorney." That night, I went down a rabbit hole, dug up county property laws, state vehicle codes, and even the HOA charter that Margaret herself had rewritten last spring. And wouldn't you know it, nowhere did it say anything about tractors being prohibited. In fact, the bylaws specifically excluded utility and agricultural equipment from the non-standard vehicle clause. I printed everything, highlighted, annotated, and stapled it into a tidy packet. I was ready for war, but Margaret wasn't. The next morning, a tow truck showed up anyway. Thing was, I'd parked the tractor behind my truck, which blocked the tow path. The driver looked confused until Margaret marched out of her house in a full-on sun hat like she was heading to a polo match and started shouting at him to just drag it out. I stepped outside, packet in hand. "Touch it and I sue you both," I said, handing the driver my legal packet. "Here's your bedtime reading." The guy looked it over and whistled low. "Yeah, I'm not losing my license over this." He backed out. Margaret turned beet red. "You'll regret this," she snapped. "Oh, I already don't," I said, "but you might." That was the last polite conversation we had. What came next was petty, even for her. By midweek, things had settled into a tense silence. Margaret hadn't made another appearance, which was unusual. Normally, she'd be circling the neighborhood on foot like a mall cop with a clipboard. But now, nothing. No calls, no notes on my door, not even a fake noise complaint. It was quiet, too quiet. I didn't trust it for a second. Thursday morning, I was heading to the hardware store when I noticed something strange. The HOA office, a converted garage space attached to the clubhouse, had a new sign installed across the driveway: "Private HOA access only, no trespassing." That was new and illegal. The clubhouse and driveway had always been open access for residents. We all paid dues for it. It wasn't Margaret's personal kingdom. Still, I figured I'd let it go for the moment. But that changed fast. Around noon, my neighbor Julio dropped by, shaking his head and holding a manila envelope. "She fined me for letting my kids sit on your tractor last week," he said, handing it to me. "Apparently it's considered unauthorized vehicle contact. What does that even mean?" I flipped through the papers. The citation was signed Margaret's handwriting, neat and mechanical. The date on the notice: 2 days after the tow truck incident. She was retaliating. She also threatened to suspend our clubhouse access if we didn't pay it by Friday, Julio added. That's when I knew. Margaret wasn't just targeting me anymore. She was trying to make an example out of anyone who didn't fall in line. "You still got that security camera on your porch?" I asked. Julio nodded. "Caught the whole thing? You want the footage?" I grinned. "I want all of it." By Friday morning, I had 5 sets of surveillance clips, all showing Margaret walking onto private property to post bogus citations. One of them even showed her slipping a notice into a mailbox, a direct federal violation. Another showed her yelling at a Vietnam vet across the street because his flagpole leaned slightly in the wind, Now I had leverage. But I wasn't done. I called a buddy of mine, Curtis, who worked with the county zoning board. We met for lunch, and over a plate of ribs he pulled up the original permit for the HOA clubhouse. "Look here," he said, tapping the screen. "The easement for that driveway is classified as municipal shared use. That sign, pure bluff. She can't legally block anyone from using it." I leaned back in my chair. "So if I wanted to park a certain red tractor on it?" Curtis raised his eyebrows. "Might be poetic." Saturday morning, I gave my tractor a fresh rinse, filled the tank, and drove it slowly, loudly down the street, every inch of it rumbling like thunder on asphalt. Curtains peeled back. Kids waved. A few neighbors came out onto their lawns, watching like it was the 4th of July parade. I rolled straight up the HOA driveway and parked dead center. Not blocking any emergency access, not touching the grass. Just sitting like a monument to stubbornness. Then I climbed down, pulled out a lawn chair, and sat beside it with a newspaper and a cup of coffee. 15 minutes later, the clubhouse door swung open. "You need to move that thing right now," Margaret barked, her voice bouncing off the stucco. I didn't look up. "According to the zoning office, I don't. It's a shared access driveway. You can't restrict use." Her face twitched. "This is harassment. You're disrupting official HOA operations." "You mean the operations where you fine people for imaginary violations and trespass on their property?" I said, calmly flipping a page. "I've got footage. So does Julio and the Thompsons and Erica on the corner." She faltered just slightly. I stood up, slow and deliberate. "I've got a full report ready for the county, including your misuse of HOA funds for that no trespassing sign, which, funny enough, was billed as a landscaping expense. Want to explain that one?" Her lips parted, but nothing came out. "And," I added, pulling out a printed copy of the HOA charter, "unless every single board member authorized that expense, you've committed financial misrepresentation. That's a Class E misdemeanor in this state." Margaret took a step back. Then another. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" I pulled out my phone and hit play. The audio clip was clear, her voice at full volume from a previous clip. "I don't care what the charter says. I'll rewrite it if I have to. We're not letting him win." Her eyes darted behind me. More neighbors had gathered now. Phones were out. Some were filming. Others just stood, watching. I looked her dead in the eye. "You went after my tractor, my property, my neighbors. You tried to tow something that wasn't even illegal. And now you're standing on ground you don't own, trying to enforce rules you fabricated." She opened her mouth again, but this time it was cut off by the sound of tires crunching gravel. A black SUV pulled up, with a gold county seal on the door. Out stepped Officer Heller from the Community Compliance Division, accompanied by a zoning inspector. "Got a report of unauthorized signage and misuse of HOA funds," Heller said, glancing around. "Someone want to fill us in?" I handed him the folder. Margaret tried to cut in, but Heller held up a hand. "We'll get your statement after we review this." The inspector walked over to the new sign, took a photo, and jotted something down. "This easement is public use compliant," he said. "That sign needs to come down by end of day." Margaret looked like she might combust. "Ma'am," Heller said, flipping through the packet. "We also have video evidence here of you entering multiple private properties without consent. That's criminal trespassing. And if you falsified HOA violations to collect fines, that's fraud." Margaret turned to me as if to plead. "Garrison, this is unnecessary. We can talk about this like reasonable adults." "No," I said. "You had your chance to be reasonable the moment you sent a tow truck to my home." Heller turned to me. "We're going to need to follow up with a few of the homeowners, get formal statements." "They're ready," I said. "There's 10 of them at my place right now with copies of everything." Margaret didn't speak. She just stood there, stunned, as the inspector quietly removed the illegal sign with a power drill. The screws clattered on the pavement. I climbed back onto the tractor, started it up, and rumbled it back down the drive while she was still frozen in place. That evening, a formal notification was taped to every mailbox in the neighborhood. A special election was being called to vote on the removal of the current HOA president due to credible allegations of misconduct and abuse of authority. Margaret didn't show her face for the rest of the week, but the tractor. It got a fresh coat of red paint, a new seat cushion, and a hand-painted sign across the back. Property values, intact. And every weekend after that, I made sure to park it proudly at the edge of my lawn within code, of course just to remind her and anyone else who might forget that some of us don't fold that easy. The vote to remove Margaret was scheduled for the following Thursday. In the meantime, she all but vanished from the neighborhood. Her porch lights stayed off. Her mailbox overflowed. The woman who once measured lawns with a tape measure was now a phantom. But the damage she'd done hadn't disappeared with her. I was in my garage sorting through a drawer of mismatched bolts when Erica knocked on the frame, holding a cardboard box and wearing a look that said she didn't stop by just to chat. "They've been hiding this," she said, handing me the box. Inside were dozens of sealed envelopes, all stamped with the HOA's logo, unopened and bundled with rubber bands. Most were addressed to neighbors on my street. A few were registered mail return receipts never signed. One was addressed to me, dated nearly 6 months earlier. It was a notice about a mandatory community-wide plumbing inspection I never received. "Where'd you get these?" I asked. "My cousin works at the post office in town," said a carrier filed a complaint about mail being redirected without authorization. She thought it was junk mail, but a lot of it was HOA stuff. So I checked the clubhouse drop box, found these tucked behind the cabinet. I pulled out my phone and called Officer Heller immediately. By the time he arrived, I had everything laid out across my workbench. He took one look inside. "This is bad," he said. "If they're interfering with mail, that's a federal issue, and if they redirected anything financial dues, payments, fines, that's mail fraud. Can you run with this?" I asked. Heller nodded. "I'm forwarding this to the U.S. Postal Inspector, but that's not all. We've got a forensic accountant reviewing their books. A few of the HOA's recent expenditures don't match up with what was budgeted. Like the sign. Worse. There's a $22,000 invoice for emergency landscaping last month. The vendor listed doesn't exist. And the check was signed by Margaret and one other board member. That caught my attention. Only one other board member would have co-signed anything, Howard Litzman, the treasurer. A retired insurance adjuster who had once told me he thought the HOA should run like a private enterprise. I hadn't seen him lately either. "I'll help however I can," I said. "You already are," Heller replied, "but keep your ears open. If you hear anything about Margaret or Howard trying to interfere with the vote, call me." I didn't have to wait long. 2 days later, I got a knock at my door just after dark. It wasn't a neighbor, it was a man in a wrinkled gray suit, holding a briefcase and standing under the porch light like he was selling burial plots. "Mr. Garrison?" he asked. "My name is David Murrow. I'm representing the Lakewood Hills HOA in a pre-litigation context." I stepped onto the porch, arms folded. "You're wasting your time." He opened the briefcase and pulled out a letter. "Per the enclosed, our clients intend to issue a cease and desist order regarding what they describe as a harassment campaign against current board members. They also intend to pursue damages for public defamation, obstruction of official business, and trespassing." I read the letter. It was filled with vague legalese and unsigned. No firm letterhead, no court filing reference, just threats on paper. "You know this isn't enforceable, right?" I asked. "There's no injunction, no court order. And I've got recordings, witnesses, and a zoning report to back everything I've done." Murrow shifted uncomfortably. "My clients are hoping to resolve this amicably before escalating." Amicably ended when they tried to tow my tractor and rewrite the rules to cover their tracks. He hesitated, then lowered his voice. "Between you and me, I'm not sure they're being straight with me either. They've withheld financial records and haven't responded to my firm's compliance requests. I'm reevaluating whether to continue representing them. I narrowed my eyes. Then do the right thing and walk away. He nodded once and turned to leave. But as he reached the sidewalk, he said over his shoulder, "If you get any more documents, especially financials, make copies." The next day, I went to the clubhouse. It was mostly empty, save for a maintenance guy sweeping the floor. I asked if the storage closet was open. He shrugged and handed me the key, mumbling something about quitting next week. Inside the closet were file boxes stacked against the wall. Most were labeled with dates and categories. 2022 dues, community pool repairs, violation notices. I started scanning through, taking photos of anything that seemed off, and then I found it. A folder labeled simply Litzman reimbursements. Inside were copies of checks thousands of dollars made out to Howard for consulting, legal review, and security enforcement. The dates lined up with the period Margaret was rewriting the charter. One check was for over $8,000, signed just 2 days before the illegal sign went up. I dropped the folder off with Heller that afternoon. By Tuesday, the postal inspector had arrived. Residents noticed the black sedan parked outside the clubhouse, and word spread fast. People were asking questions. Questions Margaret couldn't answer because she was still in hiding. That evening, someone rang my doorbell. It was Giulio holding a stack of flyers. "She's trying to delay the vote," he said. Got Howard to send out a robocall saying the special election violates the HOA's governance procedures. They're claiming it needs to be approved by a quorum of 75% first. "Which isn't in the charter," I said. "Right, so we're handing these out." He passed me a flyer. "It breaks down the charter rules, voter rights, and how to cast a valid ballot. We're not letting her stall this." I took a stack and hit the houses on my end of the street. By the end of the night, nearly every porch light in the neighborhood had a flyer tucked under it. Thursday came. The vote was held at the community center. People lined up out the door, some brought lawn chairs. One guy brought a cooler of soda. It was more turnout than the HOA had ever seen. I stood near the back, watching as residents filed their ballots. A few nodded at me. One woman patted me on the shoulder and whispered, "About time." At noon, the ballots were counted by a third-party mediator from the city clerk's office. No one trusted the HOA to do it. When the results were posted on the corkboard, a cheer went up. Margaret and Howard were removed by an overwhelming 91%. But it didn't end there. By Friday, federal charges had been filed. Interfering with mail, financial fraud, and abuse of power under the HOA's limited corporate structure. The postal inspector's office confirmed that over a dozen residents never received registered mail they were legally entitled to. And the county's audit found that more than $30,000 had been misappropriated over the past year. Margaret was arrested quietly, escorted from her home by 2 officers and a federal agent. She didn't say a word as the neighborhood watched in stunned silence. Howard turned himself in the next day. The newly elected interim board held a town hall that weekend. Chairs were set up on the greenbelt. People brought casseroles. There was laughter again. They promised transparency, quarterly audits, and a full repeal of every bogus policy enacted over the past year. Before the meeting ended, the board president, a retired teacher named Denise, called me up to say a few words. I kept it short. "I didn't do this alone. We all stood up. We all said enough. And we're not going back." Applause rang out, not polite, not rehearsed, just honest. The Massey Ferguson, it stayed right where it belonged, not just a tractor anymore, a symbol of what happens when you push people too far and forget that the power you're clinging to was never really yours to begin with. The week after the vote brought an unusual calm over the neighborhood. For the first time in years, the community felt like it belonged to the people who lived in it, not to the ones who tried to rule it. But cleaning up after an entrenched regime like Margaret's wasn't as simple as replacing a few board members. The new leadership had inherited a mess that extended far beyond what anyone had imagined. The interim board invited me to sit in on a transitional review meeting at the community center. Denise, the new president, sat at the head of a long folding table scattered with manila folders, thumb drives, and 2 laptops. Flanking her were the 3 newly appointed members, all residents who'd volunteered during the special election. Curtis had even dropped by in his official capacity to provide zoning clarification. I took a seat across from them with a notepad, mostly there to observe. But it didn't take long before Denise turned toward me. "We've found something," she said, sliding a folder across the table. "And we think it's bigger than any of us were prepared for." Inside were scanned images of documents not HOA related, but rather property transfer forms and land surveys. Each was stamped with dates going back nearly a year. Across the top of several of them was a company name I didn't recognize: Juniper Heights Development Group. "What is this?" I asked. Turns out Margaret and Howard had been negotiating with this firm to sell off a portion of the community greenbelt, Denise said. "The buyers assumed we'd already approved it. They tried to sell public land," I asked, flipping through the documents. "That space is protected under the Community Preservation Clause. They redrafted the plat maps," Curtis added. "Filed them under a limited-use variance that was never voted on. They submitted a fake approval letter to the county registrar's office. We only found it because the county reached out asking for final signatures." I leaned back in my chair. "They forged approval to sell off our land. Worse," Denise said, "they already accepted a down payment, $50,000. It's sitting in a private account under the name Lakewood Growth Initiative, which isn't registered with the state in any capacity." "Then that's money laundering," I said. Curtis nodded. "And if they used any HOA resources to facilitate that, like the clubhouse, staff, or funds, it could be embezzlement on top of it." Denise pushed another folder toward me. "We've already contacted the state attorney general's office. They're opening a formal investigation. But we need one more thing: witness affidavits. You've been involved from the beginning. Would you be willing to provide a statement?" "You don't even have to ask," I said. By the following day, depositions were being collected. Half a dozen residents, including Julio and Erica, joined me at City Hall to provide sworn statements. The assistant district attorney assigned to the case, a woman named Carla Jensen, took each account personally and assured us the scope of the investigation had officially widened. Meanwhile, the new board moved quickly to freeze all HOA accounts and revoke any remaining access privileges tied to the previous leadership. A forensic team was brought in to secure digital records before anything could be corrupted or deleted. 2 days later, the development company filed a civil complaint against the HOA, claiming breach of contract. But the moment the forged documents were presented in court, the complaint was dismissed with prejudice, and the judge referred the case to the district attorney for criminal review. The dominoes were falling fast now. Margaret's attorney formally withdrew representation. Howard's house was searched under warrant. Investigators removed 3 boxes of documents and a desktop tower. No one spoke for or against them at the hearing that followed, not even their spouses. The neighborhood, once divided into silent factions, had become a united front. Even the residents who'd once supported Margaret out of habit or fear now stood firmly behind the new board. They showed up at every public hearing. They spoke at council meetings. They signed affidavits and petitions. They stood up, one after another, and made it clear this neighborhood would no longer be a playground for power-hungry opportunists. I was back in my garage one afternoon working on a retrofitted sprayer attachment for the tractor when Denise stopped by again. She didn't say anything at first, just handed me an envelope. Inside was a printed announcement. The Lakewood Hills HOA had passed a resolution to convert the Greenbelt into a protected community trust. Ownership had been formally transferred to the residents irrevocable, with no option for sale or lease. "You made this happen," she said. "We all did," I replied, but she wasn't finished. We're also creating an oversight committee, one that includes non-board members. We want you on it. I hesitated only a moment. I'm in. The following week, the final piece fell into place. Margaret and Howard were officially indicted by the state on multiple charges: conspiracy to commit fraud, forgery, embezzlement, and unlawful conveyance of protected land. The grand jury returned unanimous approval. Their trial date was set, and both were denied bond due to the ongoing risk of evidence tampering. In the aftermath, the community went through a quiet transformation. The clubhouse, once a symbol of control, was repurposed as a shared space for workshops, after-school programs, and open forums. The board meetings were no longer closed-door affairs. They were held on the lawn, under string lights, with everyone welcome. The tractor stayed parked near the edge of my driveway, not as a challenge anymore, but as a fixture. Kids climbed on it, neighbors borrowed it. And every spring, I used it to till the soil for the new community garden that stretched across the greenbelt, the very land Margaret had tried to sell out from under us. One afternoon, as I was loading topsoil into the bed of the tractor, a man in a pressed shirt and khakis walked up. "Nice machine," he said. "You the one who fought off the HOA?" "I just drove the tractor," I said. "The neighborhood did the rest." He looked around, taking in the garden, the freshly painted clubhouse, and the kids running across the lawn. "Not bad for a bunch of folks with lawn chairs and security cameras," I smiled. "Turns out that's all you need when truth's on your side." He gave a small nod and walked on, and that was it. No more threats, no more fake fines, no more whispered warnings from clipboard tyrants. We didn't just take back our neighborhood, we rebuilt it, together.